السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين، أما بعد. So we're continuing today, inshallah, with the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam. And last week we had touched upon some of the blessings that Sulaiman alayhi salam had been given. And so today, inshallah, we're gonna talk about a bit more of the detailed of some of those blessings, the kingship that Sulaiman alayhi salam has been given, and some of the lessons maybe we can learn from that. And then if we have time, inshallah, we're gonna go into the conversation that Sulaiman alayhi salam had with one of his subjects, which was the hudhud, the hoopoe, and how that went, the conversation went, and some of the perhaps lessons also, or messages that we can deduce from the Quran and the verses that we look at. So when we look at Sulaiman alayhi salam, the details of some of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed to be subjugated to under the control of Sulaiman alayhi salam. There's several verses in the Quran that talk about this, about 4 to 5 verses, but I'm going to limit myself, inshallah, to 3 to just show some of those details. And one of them is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ غُدُوُّهَا شَهْرٌ وَرَوَاحُهَا شَهْرٌ وَأَسَلْنَا لَهُ عَيْنَ الْقِطْرِ وَمِنَ الْجِنِّ مَنْ يَعْمَلُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِ وَمَنْ يَزِغْ مِنْهُمْ عَنْ أَمْرِنَا نُذِقْهُ مِنْ عَذَابِ السَّعِيرِ يَعْمَلُونَ لَهُ مَا يَشَاءُ مِنْ مَحَارِيبَ وَتَمَاثِيلَ وَجِفَانٍ كَالْجَوَابِ وَقُدُورٍ رَاسِيَاتٍ اعْمَلُوا آلَ دَاوُودَ شُكْرًا وَقَلِيلٌ مِنْ عِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. So that's one verse. The other one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَسَخَّرْنَا لَهُ الرِّيحَ تَجْرِي بِأَمْرِهِ رُخَاءً حَيْثُ أَصَابَ وَالشَّيَاطِينَ كُلَّ بَنَّاءٍ وَغَوَّاصٍ وَآخَرِينَ مُقَرَّنِينَ فِي الْأَصْفَادِ هَذَا عَطَاؤُنَا فَامْنُنْ أَوْ أَمْسِكْ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ وَإِنَّ لَهُ عِندَنَا لَحُسْنَ وَإِنَّ عِندَنَا لَزُلْفَى وَحُسْنَ مَآبٍ. And the last one I'm going to mention, inshallah, today is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ عَاصِفَةً تَجْرِي بِأَمْرِهِ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهَا, until the end of the verse, inshallah. And so if you look at the meaning of those verses, essentially what they're talking about is some of the blessings, or we can consider it some of the creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that became the soldiers of Sulaiman. They became subjugated under the control of Sulaiman alayhi salam. And the first one, few verses that I mentioned, the meaning of the interpretation of is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, when he said وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ Sulaiman, which means and to Sulaiman, we subjugated the wind, right? وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ غُدُوُّهَا شَهْرٌ. غُدُوُّهَا, which means the wind in the morning journeys, was that it's a month, and then rawah is the afternoon, a journey of it is a month. And we're going to explain what that means, inshallah. وَأَسَلْنَا لَهُ عَيْنَ الْقِطْرِ, which means we made for him, أَسَلْنَا, which means we made it into kind of like fluid or liquid, for him, copper, عَيْنَ الْقِطْرِ. وَمِنَ الْجِنِّ مَنْ يَعْمَلُ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِ, and among the jinn, those who work for him by his permission, by the permission of his Lord, and whoever deviates among them, وَمَنْ يُزِغْ مِنْهُمْ, or whoever deviates from them, from our command, the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the command of Sulaiman, we will make him taste the punishment of the blaze. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, اعملوا آل داوود شكرا وقلوا من عباد الشكور. I said, work, O family of Dawood, in gratitude, and a few of my servants are grateful. Actually, I missed the verse. يعملون له ما يشاء من محاريب. Alright, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying what they perform for him, the jinn, is that they make for him what he formulated, elevated chambers, maharib, وَتَمَاثِيلَ وَجِفَانٍ كَالْجَوَابِ, and statues and bowls like reservoirs, the size of it is like reservoirs, وَقُدُورٍ رَاسِيَاتٍ, and stationary kettles. Now the other verse, فَسَخَّرْنَا لَهُ الرِّيحَ تَجْرِي بِأَمْرِهِ رَخَاءً حَيْثُ أَصَابَ, and we subjugated to him the wind, right? تَجْرِي, which means blowing, رخاء, which means gently, حيث أراد, which in whatever direction that he wants, ومن الشياطين, and from the devils or jinn, every builder and diver, كل بناء وغواص وآخرين مقرنين في الأصفاد, and others bound together in shackles. هذا هذا عطاؤنا, this is our gift. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying this is our gift. So grant or withhold without account, and indeed from Allah is His nearness to us and to His place of return. And the last one I kind of mentioned is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ رِيحَ عَاصِفَةً, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over here described the rih in a different way. First He called it gentle, but this one He said, and to Sulaiman we subjugated the wind, blowing forcefully, right? So the first one was gentle, this one was blowing forcefully, proceeding by His command towards the land which we had blessed. Now, when you look at these verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, when they talk about Sulaiman alayhi salam, once again they talk about a lot of, if you look at it, some even of the natural resources like wind. It's from the natural environment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had subjugated under the command of Yusuf alayhi salam. And it really, these things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had granted to Sulaiman alayhi salam, they're various ones. And so we'll look at each one of them. The first one obviously is the wind, right? So what does it mean when Allah subjugated the wind for Sulaiman, right? What does that mean? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فَسَخَّرْنَاهُ رِيحَ تَجْرِي بِأَمْرِهِ وَالرُّخَاء حَيْثُ أَصَابَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala subjugated the wind for him that it will run رُخَاء, gently, whatever He willed. And so essentially we're talking about a creation, one of the greatest creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the wind. The wind is the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what it means is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the wind as a means by which it transported Sulaiman wherever he desired. Right? It transported Sulaiman wherever he desired. Whatever place he wanted, the wind would carry him and his subjects, alayhi salam, to whatever place he desired. Right? Of course, the verses in the Quran nor the Sunnah tell us how this happens. Right? Of course, sometimes you hear some of and these are not authentic narrations, but sometimes history books or some big narrations talking about, it would carry them on chairs or carry them on carpets or whatever those cases are. But Allah Alam, we don't know really how this happened. All we know is that this was a means of transportation that allowed Sulaiman alayhi salam to quickly move from one area to another. And the reason behind that is because the kingdom of Sulaiman alayhi salam was vast. The distance of the kingdom of Sulaiman alayhi salam was extremely vast. And to move from one end of the kingdom to the other, it had to happen quickly, right? And based on what Sulaiman alayhi salam had desired. And so this Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had gave that ability to Sulaiman to order the wind to transport him. Now this is also, if you want to understand how fast it transports him, this is from the verse that I mentioned earlier when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ غُدُوُّهَا شَهْرٌ وَرَوَاحُهَا شَهْرٌ. Al-ghudu over here is talking about the time period of the morning between Fajr and Dhuhr. غُدُوُّهَا شَهْرٌ, which means that in that time period, the distance it covers is what a normal person would cover in a month. Which means that Sulaiman alayhi salam, in that period of time, with the wind can carry him a distance of a month. Right? وَرَوَاحُهَا شَهْرٌ. Now that is the time period from Dhuhr all the way to Maghrib. It also can carry him a distance of a walking distance of a month. Which means that Sulaiman alayhi salam can travel a distance of 2 months in almost like an entire full day. From sunrise to sunset. So he can essentially, and one of the pious predecessors had mentioned this, Al-Hasan al-Basri radiyallahu anhu. He said Sulaiman would come out of Damascus, he would go from Damascus during the day, wudu, from Fajr to Dhuhr time, and he would be in a place called Istakhar, which is in South Iran, right? From Damascus, South Iran, in that period, and so he would have breakfast there, right? وَتَغَدَّ فِي Kabul, right? Kabul is in Afghanistan, right? وَيَتَعَشَّى فِي Samarkand, right? We have dinner in Samarkand, so that's back in Iran. And so that distance, because he said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hasan Basri said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala subjugated the wind to him. It made him a servant to Sulaiman alayhi salam, right? And so this tells you what kind of bounty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given Sulaiman alayhi salam. But what I point out over here, can I mention this as I was talking about the verses? The verses in the Quran, when they're talking about the wind, they describe the wind in two different ways. The first one, he said, تَجْرِيحُ بِأَمْرِهِ رُخَاء حَيْثُ أَرَادَ. Rukha means gently. Right? They would carry Sulaiman alayhi salam and his people gently. Now, the other one, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَدَخَّرْنَاهُ رِيحًا بِأَمْتُخَاءِ said, وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ عَاصِفَةً. عاصفة, which means it's almost like a strong winds, right? Like a hurricane, tornado, whatever it is, like something that is very forceful. So, one time Allah described it as gentle, the other one He described it as strong wind, which seems to be a contradiction, right? Can strong winds be gentle? No, they can't. So how do we reconcile that? Because someone can point out, it's one of those things that sometimes it's good to address. When we talk about these verses of the Quran, someone can say, hey, look, there's a contradiction. Which one is it? Is it gentle or forceful? Which one is it? Right? And is there a way to reconcile this? Could be both. How, Shaykh? Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes it's fast. Sometimes it's forceful. Yes? Okay, that could be interpretation, different situations, right? So short distances is gentle. Far distances it's fast, forceful. But here's the problem with that, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, غُدُوُّهَا شَهْرٌ وَرَوَحُهَا شَهْرٌ. That the distance will cover is a month. So that has to be forceful probably, right? Strong. It's a good interpretation, right? It could be gentle for Sulaiman and forceful for? Naturally. Okay. طيب. Let me give you a more of a modern situation, right? Most of you, I'm going to guess, have ridden planes before, right? Almost all of us rode planes. Do you remember riding a plane, Sheikh? Do you remember riding a plane? How does it feel when riding a plane? Well, you sleep the entire trip? How does it feel riding on a plane? Yeah, Sheikh. It's not that hard. How does it feel riding a plane? The seats are not comfortable. Food is not good. That's not what I'm asking you, Sheikh. How does it feel? How does the ride feel? I'm sorry to hear that. طيب, what speed does the plane fly at? 70 miles an hour. Yep, it's like in the hundreds. Sometimes it can reach 900 miles an hour. That's pretty fast, right? Do you feel it? How do you feel inside the plane? Nothing, right? It's like very gentle, like it's a smooth ride, right? I think that's the closest example I can give, maybe perhaps, of what this is referring to. So in reality, the wind is moving forcefully, fast. But for Sulaiman alayhi salam and his subjects that are being carried by that wind, it's a gentle ride. Does it make sense? Yes. Of course, in the past, also when we talk about traveling from one place to another, a walking distance of a month, traveling in just a few hours, they're it was incomprehensible. Like people can't imagine it. But nowadays, we do that almost every day. Like people around the world do that every day. They start in one country, within a few hours, they used to take an entire month walk there, they just landed, right? What takes an entire day takes 15 minutes of a plane ride. And so now we understand with our modern technology But back then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made the wind the means of transportation that would carry Sulaiman alayhi salam and his subjects or whomever he willed with him. Right? So that is the first, the first thing or first bounty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given Sulaiman alayhi salam. And that is the first, that's one of the natural resources, which is he subjugated the wind to Sulaiman alayhi salam. Now the other one is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had subjugated also the shayateen, right? وَمِنَ الشَّيَاطِينَ كُلَّ بَنَّاءٍ وَغَوَّاصٍ وَالشَّيَاطِينَ كُلَّ بَنَّاءٍ غَوَّاصٍ. And also the devils, the jinn, every builder and diver, right? Now, what's interesting is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word shayateen, okay? Now, jinn and shayateen is one of those terms that do not necessarily include one another. Let me explain. Jinn is referring to a creation. Jinn is referring to a creation. Jinn is referring to a creation that has been created from fire, right? From the smokeless part of the fire. Shaitan has more of a specific meaning, right? Shaitan, those are the ones that retaliate, right? The ones that are disobedient. So it's more of a specific description. So not every jinn is a shaitan, right? Not every jinn is a shaitan. The shaitan are the ones that are defiant, that retaliate, that go out of the bounds and disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That in fact sometimes purposely it's almost as if they are taking Allah as an enemy. This is why sometimes we call human beings a shaitan, right? Sometimes we call human beings a shaitan because that meaning is associated with it. And the shaitan is called a shaitan because shatana, which means ba'uda, right? He went outside, he retaliated. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those specific ones, like the ones that are considered retaliatory, they retaliate, they disobedient, even those Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them under the control of Sulaiman. To that point. So it's not just only the jinn, but even the marada, the disobedient ones were under the control of Sulaiman alayhi salam. And they used to act upon his orders, and whomever would defy any sort of the orders, they would be punished, right? Either immediately or the hereafter, they will still be punished. And so what were their jobs? Right? What were their jobs? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned several of those jobs. He said, وَكُلَّ بَنَّاءٍ وَغَوَّاصٍ. Right? So in this verse, كُلَّ بَنَّاءٍ وَغَوَّاصٍ. Banna is a builder. Ghawas is a diver. So we're talking about the land and the bodies of water, right? The sea, the oceans, whatever the case is. And so the ones in the land, banna, those who build, they used to build for Sulaiman alayhi salam whatever he needed, whether it's for his army or for his economy or for his cities, whatever he needed, they would build for him. Now the divers, on the other hand, what would they do is they would dive perhaps, and some of the scholars of tafsir they mention, is that they would extract the treasures in the sea, because this would be used to kind of fund whatever Sulaiman needed in terms of army or resources that he needed to establish his kingdomship, right? To maintain it. And so the treasures of this world were also given to Sulaiman alayhi salam, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَيَعْمَلُونَ عَمَلًا دُونَ ذَلِكَ, and they do other jobs other than that, right? So there's many other jobs, right? And so what the point is over here is to show that, or to indicate that Sulaiman alayhi salam, the other bounty he was given was that part of his soldiers or subjects were the jinn, not just the obedient jinn, but even the disobedient jinn, right? The shayateen would also be subjugated. Now, some of the other jobs that were specifically also mentioned, so these, for example, the ones that would build, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَعْمَلُونَ لَهُ مَحَارِيب, right? Maharib is what? What's mihrab? Maharib. When you say mihrab, what comes to your mind? Place for prayers, right? This mihrab, right? Now, this I'm asking is because it's very important for us to realize that sometimes what we understand culturally is not necessarily the meaning. right? Does not necessarily mean. So mihrab over here is it's translated in English as like elevated chambers, but it does mean like buildings, like huge chambers. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that mihrab behind me, right? And I'm pointing this out why, because once again, it's very important for us to understand that when we're reading some of the verses of the Quran in Arabic or the Hadith of Prophet ﷺ, not to interpret it based on our own culture and based on our own modern colloquial language, because that will result in a distortion in our understanding. Right? We have to base our understanding of the Quran from the language that was of the Prophet ﷺ, from the culture of the Prophet ﷺ, because this is when it was revealed, and this is the correct meaning of things. Wallahu alam. Now over here, maharib is over here just referring to buildings, and the scholars of tafsir, they differed and they mentioned several opinions of what kind of buildings, whether they are military buildings, whether they like fortresses and so forth that you can fight the enemy with, or whether they're buildings of worship. Right? So it's not a mihrab like this, but it's actually buildings of worship. And so it either means for military purposes or for worship purposes. And both of them are a form of jihad. Both of them are a form of jihad that were meant to support Sulaiman alayhi salam and the community of Sulaiman alayhi salam and the kingship of Sulaiman alayhi salam. Now that is maharib, watamathil, and statues. So they also built statues for Sulaiman alayhi salam. Whatever he willed, whether they're from marbles or stones or wood or whatever, anything that would look like other creatures. And so these will be built based on the order of Sulaiman alayhi salam. Now here's a question. Can someone say, hey, look, in the Quran, a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he ordered the jinn to make for him statues. And so it is permissible for us to build statues and have them and acquire them. Right? Because based on some of the scholars' opinions, the legislation of previous nations is also a legislation for us. Okay? Is that thought process understood? Yes? What do you think of that opinion? Okay, two people are talking at the same time. And the funny thing is, none of you, I can hear you. All right, one at a time. Well, Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal would differ from you. Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal would say the legislation of previous nations is a legislation for us. That's a good one. Now, by the way, I purposely left a qualifier. So Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal did say the legislation of previous nation is a legislation for us, provided it does not contradict an order in the Quran or Sunnah, which means that it does not contradict a legislation in our Sharia. So which means if our Sharia stated something and the previous Sharia mentioned something contradictory to it, we ignore the previous Sharia. But if there's no legislation regarding that topic or subject matter in our legislation, then the previous Sharia is a continuation that can be adopted and taken as a ruling. Make sense? Now, of course, the Prophet in Islam, we know that it is prohibited. It's prohibited to create statues of full figures. Okay. Now, I'm saying full figures because it's agreed upon that those full figures are impermissible. What area is permissible is a debate between the scholars, right? So what constitutes an impermissible statue is there's a debate. But generally speaking, the overall is that statues is something that is prohibited in Sharia. So no one should use this as an example to say it is okay. Because remember, previous prophets had legislations that are suitable for their time. In our time being the final revelation, that requires no change afterwards, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated the final legislation, and some certain things that were prohibited before might be allowed in our sharia. Some things that were permitted before might be prohibited in our sharia. Make sense? Are you confused? Long time ago, right? No? طيب. The other thing that they were built, so this is محاريب وتماثيل وجفان كالجواب, right? وجفان كالجواب is talking about containers, right? So these are bowls like reservoirs, right? So they would create for Sulaiman alayhi salam these containers that are so large that they're like almost like reservoirs. They contain a lot of things which they can store in it, whatever the case is. وقدور راسيات. القدر over here in English is quite often translated as a kettle, right? That are firm and established. But anyway, so these are some things that these shayateen would build for Sulaiman alayhi salam. طيب. The other thing, right, the third thing that was mentioned in some of these verses that was given to Sulaiman alayhi salam, so it's not just like, the shayateen كل بناء وغواص. So we mentioned every builder and diver. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned also another thing that was given to Sulaiman alayhi salam, and that is وَآخَرِينَ مُقَرَّنِينَ فِي الْأَصْفَادِ. So there are other forms of shayateen, but he described them as مُقَرَّنِينَ فِي الْأَصْفَادِ, which means that they are bound by or shackled by chains. So what are these shayateen that are shackled by chains, and why are they shackled by chains? When we talk about the shayateen or jinn, they serve him. Either they build or they dive and they do other jobs. But there's a specific category that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that they are chained, shackled. Why is that? Exactly. These ones are the extreme, even though the deviant shayateen are also subjugated. But these shayateen are like, there is no good in them whatsoever. Absolutely. That if they are allowed to run rampant, they would corrupt people. They would corrupt people, individuals. Now, this is very similar to how, for example, for us, as the Prophet ﷺ said, when the first night of Ramadan comes in, what happens to the shayateen? They are chained. Exactly the same thing, right? But for Sulaiman alayhi salam, it seems that they were constantly chained. For him, alayhi salam, they were constantly chained. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. Now the other bounty that was mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَسَلْنَا لَهُ عَيْنَ الْقِطْرِ. وَأَسَلْنَا لَهُ عَيْنَ الْقِطْرِ, which is we made flow for him, like as a liquid, copper. And so it was mentioned that copper for Sulaiman alayhi salam was so easy to mold, right? That it was fluid. It's almost like a liquid, that he shaped it in any way he wanted, for whatever thing that he needed, whether it is for weapons or whatever the case is. And so he would use it, and it was subjugated that it became so soft and fluid for him. He would shape it any way without having to heat it. Now this is similar to his father Dawood. What was he given? Iron, right? Iron. وَأَلَنَّ لَهُ الْحَدِيدِ. Alanna, which means we made lean for him, the iron, that he would be able to bend it and do whatever he wanted with it, Dawood alayhi salam. But for Sulaiman alayhi salam, he gave him the copper, right? He would be able to use that. Now, one thing that's that we can that we can learn from this, if you look at it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَسَخَّرْنَا وَأَلَنَّا. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying he's saying that we are the one that subjugated for him. We are the one that ordered. We are the one that made liquid. And so who's doing all these things? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And so we learn from this, because when we're looking at what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided for his pious messenger and servant and prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, this is a message that is sent to us, that the one that controls everything is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one that controls everything is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah will subjugate it to whomever He wants from His servants. Right? He will subjugate those things, those creations, to whomever He wants from His slave. And so the closer the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to Allah, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make this dunya subjugated to that individual. A lot of times it's in ways that they don't even are aware of it. Things that are way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, will subjugate people to fulfill, for example, His needs easily. He'll want something, somebody will come and do it for him. In whatever subhanAllah situations, right? He needs to do something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can even, change or subjugate the weather system for them. And we see this in some of the subhanAllah, the stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the Prophet had mentioned for us. I'll give an example, right? The Prophet had mentioned a story of an individual. He heard when he was walking an order to go and rain in this crop area. Go and rain in this area. And so he's looking, he's like, what is this voice? And he saw a cloud moving, and it's not raining, it's moving a certain area. And he followed it. Once it got to a certain area, it started raining. And so he asked that person, the farmer, he's like, I heard this one happen, what is going on, whatever the case is. And to make the story, a bit short, not to prolong it, this individual, this farmer, what he would do is that he would crop that land and he would give a third of it as charity, right? A third of it he would maintain to feed himself and whatever he needed, and a third he would put back into the ground, essentially. But it's because this was a righteous servant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would order the angel, right, to send the cloud rain to a specific area for the needs of that person. This is an example of the creation being subjugated for this individual. Of course, that righteous person did not know this is happening. They're unaware of it. And so things like that would happen if a person is righteous, right? And this is a message for us. It means subhanAllah, the closer we are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more obedient we are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more this world become our servants. But if it's the other way around, if we don't serve Allah, but rather chase this world and do as much as we can to get it, essentially we be the slaves and servants of this world, the opposite would happen. Right? Remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world for us. And the best way to attain it is by obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? By being the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And our main intention is the hereafter. And this was mentioned once again by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, "Man kana hammu al-akhirah, jama'a Allahu lahu shamla, wa ja'ala ghinahu fi qalbi, wa atatu ad-dunya wa hiya raghima." Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whomever this individual, when he wakes up in the morning, his concern is the hereafter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would gather his affairs for him. Right? Gather everything for him. وَجَعَلَ غِنَى فِي قَلْبِ, and he made his richness feel rich, content in his heart. وَأَتَتُ الدُّنْيَا وَغَرَامًا, and this world will come to him, right? Forcefully. It will come. It will serve that individual. However, the opposite, whomever wakes up in the morning, وَكَانَتِ الدُّنْيَا هَمَّهُ, is concerned in this world, فَرَّقَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ أَمْرَهُ, Allah will disperse his affairs. He'll find it it's difficult. He tries to grab it from here, from there. Everything just spread apart. وَجَعَلَ فَقْرَهُ بَيْنَ عَيْنَيْهِ, and he will make that person always feel impoverished. He always see that he is poor, in need. وَلَمْ يَأْتِي مِنَ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا مَا كُتِبَ لَهُ, and he will only get what is written for him. Right? That is the difference. Right? And so this, if we can take something from this, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if Sulaiman alayhi salam, being the messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subjugated everything for him. This is not limited to Sulaiman alayhi salam, but also to every righteous servant. Of course, it's not at the level of Sulaiman. We can't just order the wind, right? Or order, things like that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in ways that He sees befit, will make these things subjugated for us. Wallahu alam. طيب. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ended some of these verses when he said هذا عطاؤنا فمن أو أمسك بغير حساب. He's saying, Sulaiman alayhi salam, هذا عطاؤنا, this is our gift. عطاء is a gift. أعطى, which means to gift something. هذا عطاؤنا, this is our gift that we grant you. فمن أو أمسك. فمن, which means to grant others or withhold from others without account. It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling to Sulaiman alayhi salam is that this is our gift to you. You are free to deal with it whatever you want. Whether you gift it to whomever you will, or you would withhold it from whom you will, without any sort of an account. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِنَّ لَهُ عِنْدَنَا لَزُلْفَى وَحُسْنَ مَآبٍ. And this is how it ended. And indeed, for him, which means for Sulaiman, لَهُ عِنْدَنَا لَزُلْفَى. Zulfa over here, what it means is a high status, like a nearness and closeness. And this is in this world, right? There is a station of closeness. وَحُسْنَ مَآبٍ. Ma'ab is in the return. Husn, which means what? Good. Which means this is referring to the hereafter. So even in the hereafter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's even something better and more of gifts and rewards for Sulaiman alayhi salam. Right? Also similarly, every servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is a righteous servant of Allah will also have something that is similar in terms of closeness in this world and gifts and rewards, but also in the hereafter. Right? Wallahu a'lam. طيب. The next verses that we look at or part of the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam. Now, as I mentioned last week, Sulaiman alayhi salam was mentioned in the Quran a bit more than his father Dawood alayhi salam. And one of the larger parts of the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam you'll find in Surah An-Naml, right? Surah An-Naml, where he talks about the kingdomship of course, like, we talked about the conversation that he had with the ant and part of his soldiers, and when he went out, we talked about that, I think, in the 2 lectures ago, maybe, perhaps. Wallahu alam. There's a continuation after that of when Sulaiman alayhi salam was inspecting his army, right? When he's inspecting, alayhi salam was inspecting his army, and the conversation he had with the hudhud. Hudhud is the hoopoe, okay, a type of bird. And then it goes into the story of, Sheba, right? The queen of Sheba, Saba. So today, inshallah, I'm going to try to cover that conversation and some of the lessons we can draw from that conversation. And in these verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَتَفَقَّدَ الطَّيْرَ فَقَالَ مَا لِيَ لَا أَرَى الْهُدْهُدَ أَمْ كَانَ مِنَ الْغَائِبِينَ لَأُعَذِّبَنَّهُ عَذَابًا شَدِيدًا أَوْ لَأَذْبَحَنَّهُ أَوْ لَيَأْتِيَنِّي بِسُلْطَانٍ مُبِينٍ فَمَكَثَ غَيْرَ بَعِيدٍ فَقَالَ أَحَطْتُ بِمَا لَمْ تُحِطْ بِهِ وَجِئْتُكَ من سبأ بنبأ يقين إني وجدت امرأة تملكهم وأوتيت من كل شيء ولها عرش عظيم وجدتها وقومها يسجدون للشمس من دون الله وزين لهم الشيطان أعمالهم فصدهم عن السبيل فهم لا يهتدون ألا يسجدوا لله الذي يخرج الخبأ في السماوات والأرض ويعلم ما تخفون وما تعلنون الله لا إله إلا هو رب العرش العظيم قال سننظر أصدقت أم كنت من الكاذبين. And so in these few verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the meaning of the translation or the meaning of the interpretation of these verses is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about Sulaiman. He said, وَتَفَقَّدَ الطَّيْرِ. And so Sulaiman alayhi salam, he took attendance of the birds. Tafaqqada, which means inspecting, to take account, to take attendance from the birds. And we mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had subjugated several creatures as part of the army for Sulaiman. Right? And that included birds, humans, and jinn. Right? And so over here he was inspecting the birds. And so he said, مَا لِي لَا أَرَى الْهُدْهُدَ أَمْ كَانَ مِنَ الْغَائِبِينَ. Why do I not see the hudhud, which is the hoopoe, or is he among the absent? And then he said, لا أعذبنه عذابا شديدا أو لأذبحنه أو لأتيني بسلطان مبين. He said, I will surely punish him, or I will punish him with a severe punishment, or I will slaughter him, right? Or unless he brings for me a clear, excuse, like a clear authorization. فَمَكَثَ غَيْرَ بَعِيدٍ. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, so the hoopoe, he kind of stayed not long, and then he said, أحط بما لم تحط به وجئتك من سبأ بنبأ يقين. And so he said, I have encompassed what you have not encompassed. So he's talking to Sulaiman alayhi salam. He says that I have encompassed, in terms of knowledge, what you have not encompassed, and have come to you from Saba بنبأ يقين, with a certain news. Right, I come to you with certain news. He said, إني وجدت امرأة تملكهم وأوتيت من كل شيء ولها عرش عظيم. He said, I found there was a woman, تملكهم, which means she essentially possesses them, right? She rules them, like she has complete rule over them, right? تملكهم وأوتيت من كل شيء, and she has been given of all things, and she has a great throne. And what is wrong with these people? He said, وَجَدْتُهَا قَوْمُهَا يَسْجُدُونَ لِلشَّمْسِ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. He said, I found her and her people prostrating to the sun instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَزَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَعْمَالَهُم. And the shaitan has made their deeds pleasing. He adorned their deeds for them. أَلَّا وَصَدَّهُمْ عَنِ السَّبِيلِ فَصَدَّهُمْ عَنِ السَّبِيلِ. And so he averted them from the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from his way. So they are not guided, right? فَهُمْ لَا يَهْتَدُونَ أَلَّا تَسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ. And he said, and so he told him, and do not prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who brings forth what is hidden from the heavens, between the clouds and the earth, and he knows what you conceal and what you declare. And then he said, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa rabbul arshil azim. He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is no deity worthy of worship except him, Lord of the great throne. And so Sulaiman, he responded and he said, سننظر أصدقت أم كنت من الكاذبين. We will see if you are truthful or you are among the liars, or you a liar. طيب. So there's several things we can look at over here. Starting from the beginning, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned Sulaiman alayhi salam, when he said وَتَفَقَّدَ سُلَيْمَانُ الطَّيْرَ وَتَفَقَّدَ الطَّيْرَ فَقَالَ مَا لِي لَا أَرَى الْهُدْهُدْ. Right? And so over here that tells us that Sulaiman alayhi salam, obviously we understand that he has a huge army, right? A lot of subjects, but he does not ignore them. He actually inspects things. Tafaqqad, right? He was like, he's taking attendance. He's inspecting who's there and who's not there, right? And so this is perhaps a one lessons we can learn for those individuals who are in charge, in whatever capacity it is to pay attention to whom they are, overseeing, to inquire, to ask, right, to see how they're doing or what they're doing. And over here, Sulaiman alayhi salam, even though he had a vast army, he was able to pick out who was missing. He was able to pick out and find out who was missing. Now, of course, this comes off, this is within the teachings of Islam, obviously, where the Prophet ﷺ, for example, said, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. All of you are ra'in, which means that you're responsible for something. You're shepherds, responsible for something. وَمَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ, which means that you will question, you're accountable for who you're overseeing, right? Which means that we will be asked, in whatever capacity we're at, whether it is within our household or company or work or whatever it is, if there's people that we are responsible for, Allah will ask us about them, right? And so it is one of the best practices, one of the prophetic practices, is that you inspect individuals. And the Prophet ﷺ would do this all the time, by the way, right? For example, after Fajr, right, when he would turn around and he would do his adhkar and look at his companions, he would actually recognize who would be missing sometimes, right? And he will ask, is there among you who is sick so we can visit? Is there somebody missing today? And sometimes he will say, I don't know, I can't find so-and-so. Where is he? What happened to him? Right? And so this is a beautiful prophetic habit that the Prophet ﷺ used to inspect, right, his companions, to take care of them. And this creates a very strong relationship, very strong bond between everybody. Right? When the people feel that the person who is who's in charge is actually working for them, right, taking care of them, that would make those who are considered the subjects or the workers or underneath them or who he's responsible for actually want to help, actually more willing to behave in ways that are conducive and beneficial to whatever the situation is, right? And so this is one lesson we can learn from that, for every person who is responsible, to make sure you inspect, and follow those who you are responsible for, whether it's your children, your spouses, work, whatever the case is. Wallahu alam. طيب. Now, the question is how did Sulaiman alayhi salam, if we're talking about thousands of birds, how did he recognize this, right? I'm going to mention, we don't know for sure, but as I mentioned something interesting in some of the books of history and biographies, they said that, Sulaiman, when he would sit or walk, that that the birds would fly above him, right? They would kind of shade him and fly above him in rows, right? It's almost like a covering in rows. And so when he would look up, and if there's an empty spot, he would recognize that there is one of the birds that is missing. And if you want to look at the details, he didn't say there's a bird missing, but he even knew the type of bird, right? A hoopoe, he said, al-hudhud. Now, when this happened, he said, مَا لِي لَا أَرَى الْهُدْهُدَ أَمْ كَانَ مِنَ what? الغائبين. So he said, why can't I see the hudhud, the hoopoe, or was he from the absent, or was he absent? So over here he gave two possibilities, right? He gave two possibilities. What is the first possibility? That I can't see him, which means that he is there, but I can't see him. He's concealed. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that he was actually absent. And then what did he do, alayhi salam? He said he's going to do something, right? There's a punishment. He said, لَأُعَذِّبَنَّهُ عَذَابًا شَدِيدًا أَوْ لَأَذْبَحَنَّهُ أَوْ لَيَأْتِيَنِّي بِسُلْطَانٍ مُبِينٍ. Okay. So, he said, I will surely punish him with a severe punishment or slaughter him unless he brings me a clear authorization, clear excuse. Okay? طيب. What this tells us is that Sulaiman alayhi salam was very decisive. Was very decisive. Can be hazm. Hazm, which means, I don't want to say sternness. What's the word for hazm? I guess decisiveness is the best word I can think of, right? But at the same time, he was just. Why am I saying he was just? What options are we talking about? Because he just said, I'm going to punish him. Or I'm going to kill him, right? Slaughter him. So I was good, excellent, right? Unless he brings me a good excuse. Because passing judgment on a person who is absent is injustice. Because that person, if they're present, they can perhaps provide an excuse that would uplift whatever ruling that is there, a form of defense. And so over here, this shows you that Sulaiman alayhi salam was just, but at the same time, he was firm, decisive, right? So as a ruler, he was firm and decisive, and you need that. But at the same time, he was very just, alayhi salam, right? Because once again, he gave that opportunity for the hudhud that he could defend himself, right? To kind of repel some sort of punishment or have an excuse. Now, this is even more amazing, is that when you look at, it's a bird, it's a subject. But Sulaiman alayhi salam gave him his right, gave him the position that he deserves. Because every creature, even if it's a bird, right, deserves to be treated with justice. Deserves to be treated with justice. All right, so which means that over here, essentially, in a nutshell, Sulaiman alayhi salam is saying, if the hudhud comes, right, I will listen to him. I will listen to his excuse. And if it's a valid excuse, that is fine. If not, then he will be punishment. Right? He will be punished. طيب. And when he said لَأْتَنِي بِسُلْطَانٍ مُبِينٍ. Sultan mubin over here, which means clear, like, evidence. Mubin, which means clear. Sultan is evidence, a really good excuse to explain his absence. Okay. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَمَكَثَ غَيْرَ بَعِيدٍ, which means that the hudhud, right, he or the hoopoe, he stayed, but not for too long. So immediately after, so which means that once Sulaiman said what he said, there wasn't a long time period that passed, and the hudhud had come. He arrived. Okay. Now the hudhud, what he was going to do over here, he was going to report something. He was going to report something to Sulaiman alayhi salam. Right. Now the way, if you look at the entire, what he reported and how he reported something important for us when we deal with news. I'm gonna comment about that. But also in how we relay things is very fundamental and important, especially as Muslims. So the hudhud said when he came, the way he spoke to Sulaiman alayhi salam was very interesting, because remember, he's a subject. So he came and he told him, لَقَدْ أَحَطْتُ بِمَا لَمْ تُحِطْ بِهِ وَجِئْتُكَ مِنْ سَبَإٍ بِنَبَإٍ يَقِينٍ. He said, I have encompassed what you haven't encompassed. So I want you to imagine, just imagine, the king of whatever country, or the prince of whatever country, and one of his servants comes and tells him, I have encompassed what you haven't encompassed. What would happen? Sheikh says, it's true, right? It's true. What does this tell us? There is justice, obviously, right? Say it again. Freedom of speech. It meant that Sulaiman alayhi salam gave his subjects the right to voice their opinion and speak freely. To voice their opinion and speak freely. I don't want to use freedom of speech because that can be very, I don't know, without qualifiers. It's important, right? We can't just say anything, right? There's boundaries. But even a weak creature like the hudhud had the right to speak to the king and prophet and give him information. And when the hudhud came, what he did was he spoke in a way that absorbed the anger of Sulaiman alayhi salam. Right? First thing he told him, he said, I have come with knowledge that you don't possess. I have acquired knowledge that you don't have. This is what it means, I've encompassed what you haven't encompassed. Which means I have come with knowledge that you do not have. وَجِئْتُكَ مِنْ سَبَإٍ بِنَبَإٍ وَجِئْتُكَ مِنْ سَبَإٍ بِنَبَإٍ يَقِينٍ. And it came from Saba, which is in Yemen. Right? بِنَبَإٍ, with a news that is certain. With news that is certain. So, one thing I want to point over here is that the hudhud, what is reporting over here, is it something that he heard from somebody else? No. Is it something that he thinks might be true? No. Did he say there was a place? No, he's very detailed. First thing he said, I have encompassed, which means he had full knowledge of what he's talking about. Right? And then he is certain of it. And then he also specified the place. And then if you go into the conversation a bit deeper, he spoke in details. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because in the modern time that we live in, with how information gets transmitted, it gets transmitted in a way that is very distorted. People tend to move information from one place to another without having complete knowledge of what it is, without having certainty in the information. And what that results is the spread of rumors and falsehood. Right? So this is a lesson as individuals, let alone if we function as reporters, right? Now, in the modern day, we're suffering from reporters, right? A reporter might do something and it's his work, but unfortunately they don't even do it 100% completely, and then other reporters just transmit what that person says without even knowledge and authentication and verification or anything like that, right? That is problematic. And the Prophet ﷺ said, in a hadith, كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ كَذِبًا أَنْ يُحَدِّثَ بِكُلِّ مَا يَسْمَعُ. It is sufficient, كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ إِثْمًا, it's sufficient for an individual, كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ كَذِبًا, it's sufficient for an individual of a lie, which means it would be considered a lie, that he transmits everything or he relays everything that they hear. You shouldn't do that, right? You shouldn't do that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. Or you who believe, if a fasiq is a person who is sinful, not righteous, heedless, comes to you with a news, a report, then verify. Tabayyanu. Verify. And we should do that. Right? The easiest thing we do nowadays in social media is what? Forward. Right? Forward, repost. No. We have to be careful what we do. Right? We won't want to be among those individuals that is the cause of spreading falsehood and false information. And unfortunately, sometimes that false information is disguised in an Islamic container. Right? MashaAllah, this is from the Prophet ﷺ. Forward it. If you don't, then you don't honor the Prophet. Send it to 100 of your friends. Right? I get these forwarded a lot, especially from elder people. Right? They feel that they're compelled or pressured without verifying. A lot of times I look at the hadith as like weak or fabricated or false information. Right? We have to be careful about these things, let alone news that can affect other individuals. Right? But the point over here that I'm pointing at is one, we moved beyond how the hudhud, Sulaiman alayhi salam gave the hudhud, a weakling, a creature, his right, his position to be able to speak and voice his opinion and defend himself. But at the same time, how he reported it is important, that he acquired knowledge and he was certain, he saw, and then he reported it, right? Now, what this also tells us, when the hudhud said, I've acquired knowledge that you don't have, this also tells us the importance of knowledge. Because the hudhud had knowledge that Sulaiman didn't have, it made Sulaiman the prophet listen to him. This is honoring knowledge. This is honoring knowledge and respecting knowledge. But this also tells us there is no individual in this world that has complete knowledge of everything. We're talking about, of course, we've seen this before, by the way, right? In multiple different stories. But in this case, I'm just going to comment. We're talking about Sulaiman alayhi salam, an individual of the vastness of his kingdom, with the immense natural resources that he was given, and the subjugation of nature for him, and him inspecting things and moving back from one end of the kingship to the other. There was knowledge that he did not have, but the hudhud had, right? And lacking knowledge does not detract from a person's status. That's very important. We need to learn. And I'm saying this because sometimes, arrogance, kibriya overcomes us. You're trying to teach me. You think you know better than me? Yes, it's possible. It is possible. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create us knowing everything. We could miss something. No matter how much experienced you are, even in your specialized field, somebody who is younger than you, or a novo, somebody who's learning something new, might acquire a piece. I'm not saying the entire subject, but a piece they may not know. You should accept that. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And as we also saw in the story, if you're with us in the story of Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khadr, how Al-Khadr had informed Musa alayhi salam that he has acquired knowledge that Musa doesn't have. And then Musa has knowledge that Al-Khadr doesn't have. Once again, this doesn't detract. The only entity that has complete knowledge of everything is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. Right? That's it. طيب. And so in this case, if you notice, Sulaiman alayhi salam actually kind of submitted almost and started listening to the hudhud. Now, when the hudhud was speaking, he was very particular about the information. And this also teaches us when we transmit information, we have to be specific and exact about what we relay. And he says, "Ji'tuka min Saba." First of all, he mentioned the name of the place, which is a city in Yemen, right? And he said, "Binaba'in yaqeen," with certain news, not wishy-washy, not possible. No, certain. I'm certain of that information. Okay. إِنِّي وَجَدْتُ إِمْرَأَةً تَمْلِكُهُمْ. He said, I found a woman that تَمْلِكُهُمْ, completely possesses them. Now this gives insight at the type of queen she was. She had pretty much complete control over these individuals, right? Complete control. And even some of the scholars mention that she even had complete conquerorship over their hearts because of how she dealt with them. It's not that she had control over their lands and possessions and that's it. But she even conquered their hearts, that her subjects actually submitted willingly to her. Right? This is one of the things that was mentioned. And then the hudhud started mentioning what that kingship possesses, the resources that they have, right? And he said, وَأُتِيَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, that she was given of all things. Over here, the hudhud, what he's saying is that anything that you think a king should have or a kingdom should possess, she has it. So essentially, it seems that it's something of a might and kingship that is parallel to what Sulaiman might have. Sulaiman was given everything in his kingdomship. And so it seems that this woman also was given all forms of resources, right? Whether it is wealth, economic power, military power, buildings, architecture, whatever it is, it seemed that she had everything. So the hudhud is also relaying what is in that kingdomship. وَلَهَا عَرْشٌ عَظِيمٌ, and she also has a great throne. And we know that Sulaiman alayhi salam also had a throne. So over here it seems that there is a bit of a, almost like what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. A what? Parallel, kind of. You're right. I don't want to say I don't want the words coming with my competition, but it's not a competition. But it's almost like a munafasa, right? That we know that there's a arsh here, then she has even a greater throne, whatever the case is. And then the hudhud said, like, وَجَدْتُهَا وَقَوْمَهَا يَسْجُدُونَ لِلشَّمْسِ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Now the hudhud obviously is a Muslim. And so when he's reporting over here, he's reporting something, and clearly something that he disliked, something that he was not happy with, and that is reporting. This is what he's coming. The problem is not that she has a kingdomship. The problem is not that she attained everything. What was the problem? That they were worshipping other than Allah. Right? They were prostrating to the sun. And this is something that seemed to have bothered the hudhud, and this is why he had come to Sulaiman alayhi salam, right? And so over here, obviously the hudhud knows, truth from false. He knows what is right from what is wrong. He knows tawheed from association with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he said something interesting. He said, وَزَيَّنَ لَهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَعْمَالَهُمْ فَصَدَّهُمْ عَنِ السَّبِيلِ فَهُمْ لَا يَهْتَدُونَ. And he said, it is the shaitan, right? And so over here, he knows guidance, but he also knows what causes people to deviate. He said that the shaitan decorated, adorned for them. He made their deeds pleasing for them, and so he averted them from that straight path. And so they would not be guided. So over here, this is a lesson for us, is that we have to be careful, not be too deceived by the shaitan, because the shaitan, what they do, what's going on? Huh? What? Okay, he has knowledge that I don't. that chai is ready, right? I know he's going to say that, Sheikh. You know, I was kind of ignored it. I was ignoring the time, hoping you guys don't notice. طيب. Give me 5 minutes. 10. I should have said 15. طيب. So over here, one thing we learn is that sometimes, or one of the ways that the shaitan deceives us into continuing to doing things that are wrong, is that he adorns it for us. He decorates it for us. He makes it for us to seem that it is good and pleasing. And that's very important, right? Because we're like, okay, this is good. How can this be bad? There's nothing wrong with this. No, it could be wrong if it defies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's order. We have to remember that we are not the reference point that judges certain things that are good or bad. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? We should never confuse that reference. We're not the reference point. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the one that tells us what is right and what is wrong. It is not us that we determine it. Our job is to determine what is happening based on the Quran and Sunnah. That is our job, right? To determine what is right and wrong based on the Quran and Sunnah. So we use our brains in that, right? But we shouldn't say, like, whatever it is, like adornments or like, be deceived by that. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. Now, I want to point also something interesting, is that when the hudhud, when he said, Allah yasjudu, that they're not prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then he started to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, الَّذِي يُخْرِجُ الْخَبَأَ فِي السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, right? The one who brings forth what is hidden in the heavens and the earth, right? وَيَعْلَمُ مَا تُخْفُونَ وَمَا تُعْلِنُونَ, and he knows what you hide or conceal and what you declare. So what attribute is he referring to? The way he's describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what are those attributes? The one who brings out what is hidden in the heavens and the earth, and he knows what you hide and what you declare, what you conceal and declare. What attribute is this? عالم الغيب والشهادة. What attribute is this? The attribute of knowledge. علم. عالم, which means knowing, right? So this is the attribute of knowledge. Why did he specify, like when he was describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is really like looking at and specifying Allah's attribute of knowledge. Why would he do that? This is the only thing that Hudhud mentioned. What is he trying to do over here? Exactly. He's pointing out indirectly that Allah is the one that has all knowledge. Not me and not you, O Messenger Sulaiman. Right? Not me, O Messenger Sulaiman alayhi salam. So Sulaiman alayhi salam, in the end, when he responded, he said, Sananzuru. Right? Sananzuru. He said, we will see. And so what he did, Sulaiman alayhi salam, because remember, he's a ruler, he's a king, he's going to have to execute something. There's something has to happen. He said, Sananzur. He said, we'll look into it, which means he was going to double check. And so this is a message for us that even though a person comes to us with trusted information, if this is going to result in an action for us, we have to verify that information. Or else we might do something wrong. أن تصيبوا قوما بجهالة وأنتم لا تشعرون. That you may afflict, tusibu, right? Afflict or harm a group of people out of ignorance and you do not know, or you're unaware. So you have to verify that information. Even if you trust a person, they're trustworthy, but we need to verify, it's okay. So he said, ننظر كنت من الصادقين أم من الكاذبين, right? أم كنت من الكاذبين, أصدقت أم كنت من الكاذبين, if you're truthful or you're from the liars, right? And so these are some of the, quick lessons that we can learn from those, from these verses, whether it is to be just, right? Firm but just. If we are people who are responsible, to inspect those who we are responsible for. When we report something, We need to make sure that we have full knowledge of it and relate completely with details in the right way as it is. None of that salt and pepper and spices that we put on the information, right? Sometimes we behave like the broken phone. It's kind of very interesting, right? Somebody says something and then they report it in their own words, but with some spices on it, right? It's like a broken phone. It starts with one thing, ends with something else, right? And subhanAllah, this happens, by the way, right? Like I was making fun of this. Like I heard that I'm moving to Texas. No, seriously, somebody's told me that I'm moving to Texas. I'm like, how did you hear that? Apparently they heard, it started that I went to a conference in Texas, but it ended up me moving to Texas, right? I did go to a conference. There was a conference in Texas. I went there, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But the first person who said that, I don't know why by the end, it morphed into, I am going to travel and move to Texas, right? That's the salt and pepper and spices that get placed on it, right? No, we have to be sure we report everything as completely as we could. And then the other thing is we have to respect knowledge, right? Knowledge, we have to respect it. We don't know everything, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one that knows everything, no matter how much younger or less knowledgeable a person from us, they might have information that we do not possess. But also, one thing we can learn and not mention is the punishment, right? Over here, I forgot to mention this. If you look at the type of punishments that Sulaiman had mentioned, it's called tadarruj. Tadarruj, which means you're moving from one level to the next. He said, لَأُعَذِّبَنَّ أَوْ لَأُعَذِّبَنَّ أَوْ لَأَذْبَحَنَّ. I'm going to punish him a severe punishment, or I'm going to slaughter him, right? So we moved from just physical punishment to death. That is moving in punishment based on what is necessary, but also being just. And the other lesson is give opportunity for others, no matter how weak their status is, or how weak they are. They have the right to speak and voice their opinion. Jazakumullah khair. Subhanakallah bihamdik shant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Next week, inshallah, if I remember correctly, we'll continue with the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam and what happened with the queen of Saba. Jazakumullah khair. You can have your tea now, Shaykh. Barakallahu feekum. Yes, question. 2 questions. Yes.